Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. How we doing? Good. My name is Troy. I'm one of the pastors here. I hope you've been enjoying Fake Spring Round 2 the last couple of days. I know I have. I'm looking forward to the game night. I don't know what skip bow is. I don't know if that is a disqualifying thing, but I would love to learn, and so I'm looking forward to that. Also, you might see a new side of me when it comes to board games because I can get quite competitive. So looking forward to having you guys know me a little bit more after that evening. Another thing about me, and this will absolutely surprise nobody, is that I'm a rule follower. Yeah, there we go. I know, right? Shocking. Who would have known? Explains a lot about my personality, I'm sure. It's been kind of drilled into my mind for years and years, what is right, what is wrong. It's amplified in my profession as well, working in our judicial system. I can often be dialed into black and white scenarios. You either do this or that. There is no in between. This belief hammered home from an early age, I'm willing to admit, has quickly turned into sort of legalism for me, right? This legalistic idea of what to do and what not to do. In order to be a good person, you had to do X, Y, and Z, right? In order to be a follower of Jesus, you had to do X, Y, and Z. And if you didn't do those things, it was easy for me to question not only you, but your salvation as well. Are you really who you say you are? Right? Are you really living up to this claim to be a follower of Jesus? I have a couple examples, things that I struggled with. I grew up in a very strict, you do not drink alcohol, period, environment, right? Like, no bueno if you participated in this. So if I saw anyone who professed to be a follower of Jesus have a beer, a glass of wine, it was over, right? I remember a very early argument that Taylor and I had in college. She doesn't even drink, is like, hey, what if I wanted to? I said, well, I don't know what to tell you. It's not going to happen, right? Very embarrassing. Anyway. But that was my mindset at the time. Like, I just could not grasp the idea of somebody participating in this, something I believed was incredibly wrong. Right? I was that guy throwing stones, condemning, that's not right, you shouldn't be doing this. How can you follow Jesus yet do this to yourself? Another example was swearing, which in my mind was worse, right? I was the walking, you kiss your mother with that mouth guy. That was me, right? And if one or two slipped out of my mouth, oh my gosh, you would have thought I committed a crime, right? Just that level of panic and concern I'd have. I remember one occasion a few years ago, this is a long time ago, at a church I attended at the time. I was at a gathering with some guys from the church I attended, and there was a couple of them who swore a couple times, and I was just beside myself. I immediately put my walls up and was just flabbergasted. Right? How can these guys be talking like this? How can they be saying these things? These are supposed to be Christians. My deep allegiance to my unwavering belief of what was true, not true, what was right, and what was wrong led to deep judgment of other people. I began to elevate myself over them. I began to make unhealthy comparisons to them. I'm a better Christian than they are because I don't drink, I don't smoke, I don't swear or do any of those things. Right? I'm living my life the right way. They aren't. This pride led to so many unhealthy things in me, things I'm still working through and trying to overcome today. But it created an inability in myself to see the wonders that Jesus was doing in other people's lives, because they participated in something I deemed evil or wrong. I cannot see past that and observe Jesus transforming these people right in front of my eyes. My belief in the rules made me miss the bigger picture of what was happening right in front of me. And I think we see the same situation play out in our passage this morning in the book of John. If you're new with us this morning or been attending the last couple of weeks, we've been going through the entirety of the book of John, and this morning we've arrived in chapter 5. The last few weeks we've been in chapter 4, and we've seen Jesus continue to take these small steps in revealing himself to others. We saw at the beginning of chapter 4, Jesus meet the woman at the well. Right? We saw him break all these cultural norms in speaking with her, and he reveals himself to her as the Messiah by knowing her past and who she is. Right? We see her run into town and share this with other people that she's met the Messiah. That Jesus offers the truth of him being the living water and the true sustenance for people as well. And then last week, Brad walked us through another sign that Jesus did, which was healing a child who was gravely ill. right? We see that's the second sign, right? The first sign, as we remember back, was him turning water into wine, and now we see him heal a child who is gravely ill. And this morning, we see a third sign take place, but one that comes with some consequences, if you will. So we'll be starting in verse 1 this morning of chapter 5. If you want to flip or tap your way there, John says this. After this, a Jewish festival took place, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. By the sheep gate in Jerusalem, there is a pool called Bethesda in Aramaic, which is 5 colonnades. Within these lay a large number of the disabled, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been disabled for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and realized he had already been there a long time, he said to him, Do you want to get well? Sir, the disabled man answered, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. While I'm coming, someone goes down ahead of me. Get up, Jesus told him, pick up your mat and walk. Instantly the man got up, got well, picked up his mat, and started to walk. So again, just prior to this, Jesus and his disciples were in Galilee. He performed his second sign, again, healing this officer. The officer approached Jesus for help as his son, as the word of who Jesus was spreading. His son was ill. He needed help. He approaches him and asks him to heal his son. And Jesus makes that comment, if you remember, that you people won't believe unless you see signs. Right, kind of this thing that could come off cold, but just kind of the reality of what was where he was in his ministry at the time. He tells him that his son will be fine, and he heads home, and sure enough, he is healed. Right, we learn of the belief of this man and how that turned into the belief of his household that, hey, Jesus is who he says he is. Well, right after this, Jesus heads to Jerusalem. There's a Jewish festival happening, and John sets our scene here and says that there by the sheep gate in Jerusalem, there is a pool called Bethesda. And I have a photo for you guys there to show. There we are. Looks nice, right? Okay. And then if you flip to the next one there, that's kind of what the idea of what this scene may have looked like at the time. So there's this pool called Bethesda, which had 5 colonnades or porches. And so, yes, I'm the picture guy this week too. I remember that. I know you guys like your pictures, so I'm included in that now. Anyway, so I want to do a little deep dive on this pool. See what I did there. That's the last one, I swear. That's it, okay? So the name of the pool, Bethesda, means house of mercy, right? John tells us that a great number of disabled people used to lie there, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. The covered colonnades or porches would have provided shade for those who were disabled and gathered there. So this area was an area which a lot of people, I don't think, really stopped at. Right? A lot of people didn't go out of their way to go visit this place because of the shape it was in and who was staying there. Right? A modern day example would have been maybe like an encampment that we see for those who don't have homes, right? But add in that these individuals would be blind or paralyzed or suffering some other form of disease. But there was another reason for the popularity of this pool. There was this kind of urban legend that an angel would come down into the pool and stir up the water. Right, the first person who would then go into the pool after stirring up of this water was made well from whatever disease they may have had at the time. Now, Scripture doesn't mention that, but some of you guys may have translations that include verse 4. Right, some of you guys may have seen that there's a skip from 3 to 5. And verse 4 is not included in most modern translations just because there's been some debate as to when it was included in the text. Right, it may have been a parenthetical that was added at a later time to kind of give this sort of context as to why this man was so obsessed with getting into this pool. And so there's just a debate about that. So people weren't sure if John wrote this at the time, if it was added at a later point. And so a lot of modern translations don't have verse 4 in it. But I think it does provide some good explanation, some good context, again, as to what was going on, why these people were there, and why it was so important for them to get into this water when they saw it stirred up, because they believed that they would be healed if they jumped into it. So Jesus goes into this space, which, again, is remarkable in itself, because, again, the only people who enter this space were people who were essentially nobody wanted anything to do with. Right? They were injured, they were lame, they were paralyzed, and so he enters this space and sees a man lying there who John says had been disabled for 38 years. Most likely, most of his life, majority of his life, he has been in this shape. And Jesus sees him, and since he is Jesus, he knows what this man has been going through, and he asks him, hey, do you want to be well? Now, this man doesn't know who Jesus is. And he explains the situation, I think in hopes that Jesus will help him, but not in the way that he thinks, right? Not in the way that he thinks. Because the reality is that this man is such poor shape, he's been dealing with these struggles for a long time and physically cannot get himself into this water to be healed. Right? He clearly believes in this legend, and you have to believe that he has tried time and time again to get himself into that water. Right? That he so desperately wants to be healed from his sickness, from his illness, and you can just imagine him losing hope from over and over and over again, just losing the hope that he's going to overcome these things because he cannot get into the water quickly. Well, Jesus hears these words, and he simply tells him to get up. Just get up. Right? We see Jesus sweep aside all this superstition. He pushes aside all this legend. Altogether, he pushes aside this need for this special water with one simple command: get up, pick up your mat, and walk. And this man is instantly cured, and he picks up his mat and walks. You see, that this guy, he didn't need quicker reflexes. He didn't need a special angel or special water. He just needed Jesus. For years and years, this man has struggled, thinking he needed to move faster to get healed, that he needed angels to look out on him to be healed, that he needed this special water to be healed, when all he needed was Jesus himself. Now, our situations today are a little bit different. But what have you spent years and years and years seeking out for healing, for favor, for explanation, instead of running into the arms of Jesus? What is your enchanted water? Right? What are some of the things that you have spent years convincing yourself that this is what you really needed to be happy, that this is what you really needed to enjoy life, instead of just Jesus himself? Because, church, as we see here this morning, that Jesus is enough, and he will always be enough. So our man is healed, he picks up his mat, he walks, something he hasn't been able to do in 38 years. Good vibes only, right? Well, no. Right? Unfortunately, as we see here in verse 9. John says, now, that day was the Sabbath. Whoopsies. Yikes. Okay, and so the Jews said to him, said to the man who had been healed, this is the Sabbath, the law prohibits you from picking up your mat. He replied, the man who made me well told me, pick up your mat and walk. Who is this man who told you, pick up your mat and walk? They asked, but the man who was healed did not know who it was, because Jesus had slipped away into the crowd that was there. Right, there's always someone who has to burst the bubbles, right? And more often than not, we see it's the Pharisees or the Jewish leaders, right? Like, goodness. So the day in which Jesus performed this miracle just happened to be the Sabbath. Right, just happened to be the Sabbath. We've taught on the Sabbath here, right? We did a practice itself in our city groups for practicing the way, right? We learned that this level of discipline it takes to observe the Sabbath from us. Well, back then, it was even more stricter. It was law. You didn't do anything, period. And if you did, you had some explaining to do, right? Which is why they grilled this man, which is why they approach him and say, what are you doing? Right? He was grilled for simply picking up his mat, the act of gathering his personal belongings, right? You imagine him probably picking up his bed where he laid all of those 38 years, and they're questioning him about it. They want to know answers. Who told you to do this? Why are you doing this? Well, he can't point Jesus out because he left in the crowd of people, and so they don't get the explanation they need. They don't get the explanation they want. Right? But I think it's interesting, their questioning here, their line of questioning here, their reaction here. Because they get an understanding, these Jewish leaders, that there is someone walking around claiming or posing to be this person with this authority to tell people what they can and cannot do. And what is simply mind-blowing about this sequence is that we have no recorded conversation or reaction from these leaders of this disabled man of 38 years suddenly being able to stand and walk. Right? They had to have known this guy from the many years that he was laying here, and we don't get one word about, oh my gosh, you're on your feet now. Oh my gosh, you're walking now. None of that. Simply, why are you breaking the law, and who told you could break it? Right? Instead of celebration, this man is met with interrogation. I think it shows here that no matter how much proof God provides, there will be people who will still refuse to see the truth of his beauty, of his grace. I mean, Jesus was a miracle worker, right? This is the third miraculous sign that we have seen, and probably his most public one yet. But the religious leaders couldn't see the miracle. All they could see was someone who violated a rule. Does that sound familiar? Right? This guy, right? Me. I would refuse to see the miracle Jesus had done in this person's life, that he saved them from themselves, that he saved them from eternal separation because they had a glass of wine with their steak, right? That's me. I'm that guy. But the issue here was not breaking of God's command because, as we know, Jesus fulfilled the law, right? He was completely subject to this. We see this in Matthew 5:17. The only thing being broken was just an interpretation of one of these laws. So a blessing meant to increase faith, only increase the blindness of those who refuse to acknowledge the blessing. Jesus' miracle of healing this man was meant to further show people of who he was, what his purpose was, and instead was completely missed by those in authority because of their inability to see beyond black and white. Brad mentioned a few weeks ago that the work of Jesus, the work of the kingdom, often goes beyond the physical, right? Goes beyond the things we cannot see or hear. These leaders struggled to look up beyond the physical. They could not get past these physical scrolls, what they can actually read, what they can actually feel in their hands. They couldn't get past it. This stubbornness and inability to look up from the page caused them to miss the reality which is right in front of them, that Jesus was the Messiah and he was working. It caused them to miss the beauty of what he was doing in these people's lives. Are you stubborn? Some of you are probably like, yeah, I am, right? What is something that you cannot overlook in your circle to see God at work? Again, reading a passage like this is so convicting for me. Because remember the guy at the top, my friend who would say such bad words, right? The guy I judged tremendously hanging around him for the first time. Well, flash forward a few weeks for me getting to know him. As I get to know him a bit better, we were hanging out one night and we start just kind of sharing, our faith stories, who we are and how Jesus has, changed our lives. And he unsolicitedly tells me his struggle was language. He's like, man, I've struggled with my mouth for years, how I talk, the words I use. But he tells me how God's grace has given him so many victories over that the last year. Hey, man, I'm getting better. That God's doing great work in me. Now, in my head, I'm trying to hide every ounce of embarrassment and feel for my attitude. Right? I try to hide the shame I feel for judging this guy and now learning of the joy he feels of God continuing to transform him into himself. I learned at that moment that the sin that my arrogance has caused has blinded me to celebrate the wonders that God is doing in his life. Things I couldn't see because of those glasses that I put on. And we get further context and explanation of this as John continues, and this is where we'll end our time this morning in verse 14. John says, after this, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, see, you are well. Do not sin anymore so that something worse doesn't happen to you. The man went and reported to the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. Therefore, the Jews began persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. Jesus responded to them, my Father is still working and I am working also. This is why the Jews began trying all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal to God. So after this interaction the man has with the Jewish leaders, Jesus finds him in the temple. We don't know if this is the next day or the same day, but it's sometime later. But Jesus finds him in the temple, and he affirms him being healed and tells him not to sin anymore or something worse will happen to you. The end of our story this morning, I think, reveals that this man who is now physically healed still needed some level of spiritual healing, right? Stop sinning or something worse will happen to you. I think we can read Jesus' words as some sort of rebuke of some sin that he have been struggling with, that the man may have been still, living contrary to God's will somehow. And Jesus offers this warning of something worse. And I think we should refrain from connecting dots that the reason this man was disabled because of some sin in his life. That's not what's going on here. We shouldn't think that the reason of his ailments was because he may have been unrepenting of some sin. We got to avoid that line of thinking. But I think we can infer that because Jesus found him in the temple, not on the street or in some market, he found him in the temple. This guy probably knew that he needed some things that he needed to work on as well. right? That, hey, my physical self is healed. I got to work on the things that I'm struggling with. And Jesus' words have to be felt because what could be worse than 38 years of paralysis? Right? What could be worse than 38 years of some ailment, of some disease? What could be worse than years of trials and suffering? Well, how about eternal separation from him? Right? That's what Jesus is talking about. If you think the life you've experienced has been hard, if you think this is as bad as it could get, keep sitting and find out. Right? Keep living the life you are, and you will see just how awful things can be. And I don't think Jesus is threatening him here. I think he's just subtly letting him know the cost of continuing to live his life as he wants to live it. Jesus has given this man an opportunity to be a witness for him, to share with other people the wonders and transformative work that he can do in people's lives. And I think this man just does that, right? He goes to the Jewish officials. I don't believe in a menacing way, right? Yeah, they may have been asking for information, but I don't think he goes to rat out Jesus or to tell on him or anything like that. But I think in a, like, hey, this is the Son of God way, right? This is the guy who healed me, and his name is Jesus. Well, this act by this man of sharing this information with these leaders triggers a response that I think we're going to see, what we will see play out during the course of this book. Right, we almost see this shift occur in the book of John, going from people's apprehension or hesitation that Jesus is the Messiah to pretty much solid opposition that he is. This starts with Jesus healing this man on the Sabbath and telling him to do something on this day as well. John says, therefore, because of this action, because of Jesus being who he says he is, persecution will start. Right? Mistreatment would begin being thrown towards Jesus. And he even responds to that himself. And he says here, that, my Father is still working. I am working also. Right? Jesus says this to the leaders who are questioning him. Hey, why are you telling him to do these things? What is going on? Well, he says simply, my Father is still working, and I am working also. Because my Father does not rest, because he continues to work in the lives of other people, I too will continue working. I too will not rest. Jesus, I think, almost presents this discussion to be had to them about the Sabbath, right? This kind of this big, buckle up, right? This idea of, like, does God keep the Sabbath law? If he does not make him, if he does not, does that make him a rule breaker? Right? But on the flip side of that, if he does rest on the Sabbath, how does the universe continue to run itself? Right? I think these officials here would acknowledge that God cannot break the law, so he does indeed work on the Sabbath. But Jesus comments about comparing himself and making himself equal to God is what sends them over the edge. It makes their blood boil. Now they are all in on this plan to kill this guy, because that's rational, right? Before he was just breaking the Sabbath, before he was just leading others to break it with him, but now he is making himself equal to God. In these leaders' minds, this made Jesus dangerous. We can't have this guy going around healing people and calling himself God, because that's not what is physically written in front of us. This is not what should be happening. This is not the guy, and we need to stop him from telling people otherwise. And Jesus doesn't even argue with that. He doesn't even argue with their interpretation if it's right or wrong. He's simply just making this truthful claim that he and the Father are one, and since his Father does not rest, I will not rest. He's saying, I'm not above the law, I'm operating within the law, because everything is his, right? Infractions against the Sabbath laws were very, very serious. Now you throw in the mix of Jesus making himself equal to God with these leaders, and it challenged their fundamental distinction between this holy, infinite God and this finite human beings who are fallen. And they were determined to do something about that. Their understanding of things, their world had been rocked, and their instinct was to begin taking out this guy instead of self-reflecting on themselves. To this day, church, I still fight this level of legalism. I'm still learning how to combat my thinking to avoid being so black and white on things. I've been lovingly determined to be resistant to change, whatever that means. We'll unpack that later. But I still struggle with dismissing people that think a little bit different than I do. I still struggle with dismissing a person for even having a simply different thought than I do. So as we part this morning, I think something that's worth all of us reflecting on is that when your thoughts are challenged, what is your initial instinct? As a follower of Jesus, when you see someone think or do something a little bit different than you, what is your reaction? Do you have a feeling of dismissiveness or denial, right? Or curiosity and care? Maybe you're here this morning and you're not a follower of Jesus. Maybe this is the first time you've really been hearing something about him in this capacity. What has your reaction been in the past of someone attempting to share this good news with you? Right? I think these are good things to reflect on because, again, the work of God goes beyond the things that we can physically see in front of us. And we need to challenge ourselves sometimes to look up and see the beauty of what he is doing in other people's lives, the miracles that he is doing, the transformative work he is doing in the lives of people right in front of us. Pray with me this morning. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for who you are and all that you do for us. Lord, we thank you for your Son, Lord, in entering this world and just the good news and this truth I've been able to read in the book of John thus far, Lord. And I pray that we would challenge ourselves in these moments of confrontation or, even sometimes conflict, Lord, that we would just think a little bit differently, would be open to the beauty that you may be working in other people's lives. Lord, that you would challenge ourselves to not be so black and white, and this is what's right and wrong, Lord, that you would heal my heart continuously and as I continue to work through those things. Lord, we thank you for your Son and being the example that he is to model our lives after as well. We pray this in your name.